Good morning. I would like to thank Professor Motzkin and Professor Salzburger for their stimulating opening remarks. My name is Wael Uksa, and I'm a Polonsky Fellow here at the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute. And I have the honor to open and the pleasure to open the first panel this morning. The Mediterranean has been an inspiration for its surrounded cultures for many decades. The prominent Algerian French Islamic scholar and philosopher Muhammad Arkoun wrote in the early 90s, and I quote, "I was convinced after serious consideration that the interaction between the European national cultures and the different humanistic modern streams of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and secularity in the new Mediterranean space would yield good results, and it would go through crucial developments in the coming decades. The future holds good promise, contrary to what many others expect." End of quote. Arkoun, who wrote these words before the upheavals of the Arab Spring, the crisis of the Arab Republican system, and the collapse of part of the Arab nation states, probably did not think about the Mediterranean as a subject of crisis. Far from Arkoun's optimism, our panel this morning will discuss instability, crisis, and emergency in the Mediterranean. Our opening address will be given by Dr. Sarah Wolff. Dr. Wolff is a lecturer in public policy at Queen Mary University of London and senior associate research fellow at the Netherlands Institute for International Relations. She is an expert on EU public policies, justice and home affairs, migration and border management policies, as well as EU-Arab-Mediterranean relations. Her monograph, The Mediterranean Dimension of the European Union's Internal Security, builds upon fieldwork in Europe, Morocco, Egypt, and Jordan. She received the Lisbon Research Award in 2012 for her book, Freedom, Security, Justice After Lisbon and Stockholm. In 2014-15, she was Fulbright Schumann Fellow at the Transatlantic Academy at Washington, D.C., where she investigated the role of religion in transatlantic foreign policy. She was also awarded in 2014-15 Leverhulme Research Grant for research on EU engagement with Islamist political parties in Morocco and Tunisia. Prior to her current position, Dr. Wolff was acting director of the MSc in European Public Policy at UCL in 2011-12. Before then, she worked in the European Commission and as a parliamentary assistant in the European Parliament. Dr. Wolff holds a PhD in international relations, an MSc in European politics and governance, and a BA in public administration. Her talk is entitled The New Geopolitics of Migration in the Mediterranean. So without further ado, Dr. Wolff.
Thank you very much for your very kind introduction. And again, I would like to also thank the organizers and the sponsors of this event. It's the first time for me in Jerusalem, and it's been a real discovery. But with no further ado, I will continue with the topic that we are going to debate intensively, I assume, today, which is, and especially in this session, because we have also experts on refugees this morning and the relationship also with Turkey, to discuss migration in the Mediterranean. And what I have planned to do today is just to provide you a few elements of introduction on future migratory trends, because I think we have to look also forward in order to if we have to make recommendations at the end of this workshop as well for the Mediterranean and EU countries, and to try to understand better the complexity of push and pull factors for migrants and refugees. I will also try to very briefly give an overview, and I'm sure maybe most of you are well aware of EU's policies so far, but try to highlight as well what has been the securitization process that has been undergoing and given more power to EU member states as well in the current situation, who are likely to renationalize their EU policies, EU collective solutions at the moment. And I think this has, in the end, an overall influence on EU's role as a global actor or regional actor in the field of migration and refugee. And it undermines its credibility and legitimacy, and it was mentioned earlier, the EU-Turkish deal is one of the most important examples in that matter. So the normative power Europe concept, as it has been promoted so far in EU external relations, is really at stake. But let me start with just a few general remarks on new migratory flows in the Mediterranean and what has been called, I think, maybe sometimes wrongly, a crisis or migration or refugee crisis. First of all, I'd like to highlight that I believe it's more a crisis of governance for policymakers, and especially for European policymakers, than actually, and for migrants themselves as individuals, rather than really a quantitative crisis coming to Europe. And I think overall it really highlights the failure of the liberal democracy promotion project of the European Union in its external relations that has been promoted through the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership, the European Neighbourhood Policy, or to some extent, the Union for the Mediterranean. And you clearly see that trade and economic liberalization in the region have not brought prosperity, have not diminished migratory flows. Obviously, you have also at the moment state failure in the region, which is one of the main drivers as well of migratory and refugee flows. But it clearly undermines the ideological basis of globalization. And I think it's important, and I think earlier it was mentioned that it's not only a regional if you want, challenge, but a global challenge, because you have 65 million refugees worldwide. And I believe that the rise of inequalities is really one of the key driving factors, push factors at the moment, also in the region and towards Europe for migrants and refugees. So in a nutshell, I'd like to say we need to stop being also Eurocentric in our approach. And I'm talking as a European working on EU policies, so I'm also happy to get your views on that. But I think what is happening in the Mediterranean is a regional and also global challenge. There are many interdependencies between sub-regions, even with the Horn of Africa, or if you think about refugees coming from Afghanistan and going through Iran, and so on and so forth. So it's a bit paradoxical that at the moment, the EU, even though it has tried to have a collective answer, is in fact providing a policy answer that is very much national and not enough transnationally thought. And we have also to understand that migratory patterns or fluxes are not independent phenomena, and they might also be a consequence of EU policies or neighboring countries, Mediterranean countries' policies as well in the region. There are new risky routes, and before I used to say, well, the EU is, this wonderful freedom of movement area and so on. Well, now I'm changing a bit my narrative when I talk to my students. The same happens for the Mediterranean. I used to say, well, if you remember Fernand Braudel, he used to say that the Mediterranean is a space of mobility. Well, today it's a space of immobility. And it has also become the deadliest destination for migrants in the world, with many people dying at sea. So how can we still contend that the EU is a normative power in the region? And I think more research should be done in trying to understand those new insecurities that are being created in the Mediterranean. And that's why I think this workshop today is very much welcome. And finally, I'd like to highlight as a brief final comments to this introduction that I think what is happening, again, and I want to insist, is new, seems new for the European. It's not new to many other countries in the world or in the region, but I believe it's the new normal for the European Union, and we'd better get used to it and to think forward. So if we think about the new normal, I'd like to start with future trends, as I mentioned, and how to look forward. So I mentioned, obviously, people are on the move due to many conflicts in the region. State failure is one of the main drivers in the MENA region, definitely, and the EU should invest more in crisis management, combining it somehow with a more extensive or comprehensive approach to migration, rescue at sea, / border management, but maybe with a different perspective. Because what is happening in Syria, obviously, is only one of the many future, if you want, issues or factor that will lead to more fluxes in the region. We can think about Eritrea as well. There is a conflict. You have Yemen. You have the situation in Kurdistan and Afghanistan and Pakistan and Libya and so on and so forth. But again, I want to insist that actually the ones who are moving towards Europe or towards the region, but often towards Europe, are more likely to be from the middle class, actually, because the poor remain trapped at home. They don't have the means to pay human traffickers, smugglers to get into the European Union. So I think this is an important element, and we should, as Europeans, think about combining more also humanitarian aid and development initiatives. This has been, an ongoing discourse, but hasn't been acted as much as the EU internal security approach towards the region. Taking into account the fact that inequalities are on the rise in the region, and I think this is really a key aspect to address. And the problem is that at the moment 86% of refugees are hosted in the global south, and in the region it's a problem for, refugees or migrants, because obviously we will talk, I think, about definitional issues. Some might start as refugees and finish as economic migrants in the eyes of the European Union, so it's a bit all mixed. But those refugees also are in competition in countries of first asylum, if you want, in Jordan, in Lebanon, in other countries for basic, resources, education, jobs, health, and so on. And I think the EU should also work in cooperation with all the countries in the region in that sense. I think, secondly, the EU has also been a bit naive, and I think the Turkish, the deal with Turkey that the EU has now agreed, or is about to agree, I think it's end of this month, if Turkey fulfill its conditions, but we will hear maybe more about this. I think the EU has overlooked the fact that states, also in the region, and it's the case also of the EU, can use refugees and migrants for geopolitical purposes. Migratory and refugee policies are not neutral. They are political inherently. So I was talking about refugees in host countries. And for instance, you have the case of mainly, for instance, Afghan migrants who are arriving to the European Union, are not actually leaving Afghanistan, but they're leaving from Iran. And they are not, just because they are not able to stay anymore in Iran. The Turkish example is really telling. And it also reflects the geopolitical strategies of Turkey vis-à-vis the European Union or vis-à-vis its neighboring countries. And personally, I've been looking a lot at the issue of EU policies towards Morocco. And you clearly see that the EU has overlooked the fact that Morocco has recently, it was in 2014, enacted a new immigration reform, which is one of the major ones in the region, but mainly because of its own trade and economic ambitions in Western Africa. And I think in designing policies, Europeans have been a bit, have had a very Euro-centered approach to what is happening in the region, and that's a problem. So we have spent a lot of money. I think between 2004 and 2014, the EU spent more than €1 billion on more than 400 projects worldwide through to support migration in external relations. However, it has promoted much more a remote logic approach, whereby it tries to co-opt third countries in securing our borders than really going through comprehensive and deep policies. And also, I think it has been mentioned already, but I think one of the, and I'm not a legal expert, so I don't want to develop on that point very long, but I believe that also the motivations of refugees and migrants are increasingly complex and not covered anymore by the 1951 Convention of Refugees. How do you deal with someone who started maybe as a refugee from the Horn of Africa or Africa, ended up in, or economic refugee that went to Libya to work and then is completely, find itself, herself or himself in a situation where it's complete chaos and becomes a refugee in the eyes of the European Union. So I think also legal tools have to be revisited globally as well and transnationally. Finally, I think one of the pull factors that has been a bit overlooked as well by the European Union and on which, and maybe I think also in the region, is the fact that migrants do not come necessarily to the European Union only because of their welfare state or because of their Western liberal model. That's what Europeans would like to believe, but they also come because of diasporas and communities. And I think this transnational link is really important and should be further explored. Very briefly, just to give you an overview of EU policies so far in the region. As I said, I think for me it's more a crisis of responsibilities and a crisis of governance than really beyond the quantitative, unprecedented numbers of refugees and migrants coming to Europe. But it has really highlighted the fact that the EU has conceived its external migration policy with internal tools, internal security tools. And that's a problematic issue if you really want to have a global leading role or a regional leading role in promoting, also norms, human rights, rule of law in the region. And it has, especially this gives a lot of, a bigger role to EU member states who really remain the gatekeepers of what is happening, what is being decided at the moment. Frontex is likely to become the future European Border Guard Agency. It's being tabled, it's being discussed at the Council, but again, there are several issues such as rescue at sea, for instance, which is not yet being completely solved, which remain, I remind you, a European member state's responsibility and not yet an EU-wide competence. It has been it has also highlighted that several legal tools, such as the Dublin Convention, is not fit for the purpose anymore, and we knew it for a long time, but again, it doesn't fit refugees' desires as well. For instance, if you look at the camps, for instance, in Calais, you see that 70% of migrants in Calais do not wait for their application to be processed and prefer to try to move already elsewhere in Europe. So we really have to revise this. Unfortunately, we have variable geometry. And this situation has, this external, if you want, shock for the Europeans has opened up new lines of fracture within EU member states. You have heard about the role of Germany vis-a-vis other EU member states, the rise of walls or new internal borders as well, or external borders for some member states, and also the fact that there is a real line of rupture between East and West European countries as well when it comes to migration. I think the main problems to my mind, and then I will move to a conclusion, is that very important solutions for the region have been completely overlooked. I discussed the issue of a European rescue at sea mission. We do have the EU NAVFOR Med, sometimes called also SOFIA mission, which nicely combines CSDP tools and somehow some migratory tools, but it's mainly to deal with human trafficking, which is really important, but still is only a very tiny part of the whole situation, which has to be addressed more with development aid and humanitarian intervention as well. Other issues, why not also offering, because you remember there has been a lot of tensions in just having a relocation program for Syrian refugees. The EU member states agreed to relocate 160,000 Syrian refugees. I think at the end of last year, it was less than 3,000 people that had been relocated. So you see there is, maybe now, sorry, I've been on maternity leave, so my maybe it has been more, but yeah, I think more efforts could be done. And for instance, by developing new tools, for instance, why not delivering humanitarian visas? For instance, why not opening legal means of migration as well? You have, as I was saying, some of the migrants coming to Europe are from the middle class, they are well educated, they have skills that Europe needs as well. Why not developing other means? But unfortunately, you have this strong and deep ingrained member states resistance as well. Finally, you have also the fact that we have a European asylum a support office based in Malta, and I think also its mandate should be expanded in order to really become a true European migration and protection agency for the rights of migrants as well. At the moment, it's really the lowest denominator, common denominator, type of policy instrument that has been chosen through this approach. To conclude, I would say that there has been a lot of geopolitical blindness from the European Union, and this undermines its overall approach to become a normative power in the region and overall globally. Instead, I believe that if the EU would, and I hope the future, I think it's about to come out as well, Mogherini's global foreign policy strategy could also take into account more demographic challenges, even from a European Union interest perspective, the fact that we are becoming an aging society and that it's not sustainable to work without migration anymore. I think migration has the potential to really increase economic interdependence and to reconcile the demographic challenges faced by older and younger countries within the European Union, but also in the Mediterranean. And it's a chance to build also links with diasporas. I think we should also favor or look at other parts of the world, such as Canada, for instance, or the US, and you have ideas such as private sponsorship as well, that could be further studied as well, which means to have private companies or individuals, groups that sponsor the arrival and hosting of refugees in Europe. Obviously, this means also that governments needs to provide a status in the end, but this could be studied further. I think the EU should conceive the EU migration policy within its external relation approach. That's definitely an important point, and we should, as Europeans, and I think that has to be thought through with Mediterranean partners as well, to think more about not only the neighbors, but the neighbors of the neighbors, to really have a more comprehensive approach and to think about the consequences of our policies for other regions or where we have a lot of interdependencies. And in the end, unfortunately, I think everything depends also on trust and geopolitical vision for this issue. So I hope we will have an interesting debate after that. Thank you.